have shown not just around the state of Alabama, but we have shown the country the way that we can be unified.
In a major defeat for President Donald Trump, a Democrat is elected to the United States Senate from the state of Alabama for the first time in 25 years. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Alabama's Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate, Roy Moore, was dogged by allegations of sexual misconduct dating back 40 years. Despite that, and against the advice of some of his fellow Republicans, President Trump went all in, endorsing Mr. Moore against the Democrat Doug Jones. In the end, backed by a historic turnout, Alabama dealt both the president and Moore a stunning defeat. There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us from Tampa, Florida, is political commentator and author Dan Perkins. With us here in Washington is Lynn Sweet. She's a columnist and the Washington bureau chief for the Chicago Sun-Times. Chip Brownlee joins us from Montgomery, where he writes for the Alabama Political Reporter, a website covering state politics and government. And also with us is my colleague, CGTN's White House correspondent, Jessica Stone. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Lynn, let me start with you. Alabama, as I said, was not elected a Democrat senator for the last 25 years. So when we look at what happened in this election, did traditional voters have a change of heart because of these allegations against Roy Moore? Was it a huge turnout by black voters? What changed?
Well, exit polls show us that the sexual misconduct allegations were not a deal killer for Republican Roy Moore. But you had a big turnout. You had a massive African-American vote. And of that massive turnout of African-American voters, 96% of them, 96, voted for the Democrat. And moreover, you had a candidate who was flawed in many ways. The sexual misconduct was the least of, well, not the least of it, was one of many flaws that Alabamans well knew about. Twice removed from his state Supreme Court seat, history of controversial comments, a bigot, a birther. This was probably the one Republican in all of Alabama who could not win in this solidly conservative Republican state. So the Democrat who won, Doug Jones, had a lot of advantages going in, though it obviously wasn't clear that he was going to win, and it was relatively close.
Dan Perkins, Moore's defeat is being described as a major defeat for President Trump. I mean, as Lynn Sweet just pointed out, are you surprised that, you know, we have a solidly conservative state like Alabama, which has now been taken by a Democrat?
I'm not surprised, given the amount of national publicity and the number of reporters and personalities who were in the state of Alabama. I think the accusations of the 40-year-old sexual harassment or whatever it was he was accused of had an impact on the polls and on the voters. Interesting enough, the one lady who claimed that she was assaulted and that Moore had signed her book later said that she had forged the note. It wasn't really him. But I think it was probably too far gone.
What she forged the whole note.
No, sir, that's not what she said. So
she made an addition to the note to clarify when and where it happened. That's a far cry from forging the entire note.
Okay, go ahead, Dan.
I'm just saying that I think that the idea that this is a major defeat for Donald Trump, when I heard Chuck Schumer this morning say, as a result of Alabama, we'll probably have a much better chance of winning the House and the Senate, is wishful thinking, because the Democrats don't have a platform. They don't have any ideas. They're still working on collusion and Russian and now obstruction of justice. That's not a platform that's going to appeal to a broad base of voters in the midterms or in the presidential election in 2020.
Can I actually jump in here? I agree with him in the sense that I don't think there's is going to be some kind of momentum for Democrats in Alabama, but I don't necessarily agree to his reasoning as to why. I think in 2 years it's going to be hard for him to prove that he can earn the constituents' votes again in 2 years, and it is a Republican state. I've lived there for 7 years of my life. It is hardcore Republican, and many of the things that Roy Moore did say, which are controversial in the rest of the company, still do appeal to some voters in Alabama, where they wouldn't have appealed to anybody else. I mean, I think the big winner here is actually the Republican Party, because they will be able to disassociate themselves from Roy Moore. They're not going to have to answer for another set of allegations on a Republican candidate, and they can run another candidate, a better candidate, in 2 years. And they also are going to have time to get all of that together in the time.
But I think, I think you have to understand that the issue here is going to be in 2018, the midterms. What is the state of the economy? You've got, for example, the point you made earlier, which was a good one, that the blacks turned out in record numbers. But I also know that the black unemployment rate on a national basis is at a 17-year low. And so that the economy growing, Goldman Sachs says the economy is going to be over 4%. People are going back to work. People have money in their pockets. Right. It's going to be hard.
Okay, go ahead, Len, and then I want to get to Chip, but you first.
No, I mean, if you want to do Chip, because I've had one turn, so then
okay. Well, let me go to Chip. Chip, I mean, you've heard all the arguments and why the election turned out the way it did. I mean, if we look at this, just 13 months ago, Donald Trump took 62% of the vote in Alabama. So what does this election tell us about the way Alabama voters behaved?
Yeah, like you said, this is a seismic shift from what we've seen in past elections. I mean, the last time there was a Senate election in Alabama, there was basically no Democratic opponent. Senator Shelby got a vast majority of the vote there. So I think what this tells me about Alabama voters is that Roy Moore was a troubled candidate. He was a problematic candidate, and you know, I think it just says that Alabama voters were tired of the rhetoric that he uses, and Doug Jones offered an alternative. And with that, in combination with the sexual assault allegations, it put Jones over the edge.
So, Lynn, do you also agree that Roy Moore was an exception to what we are going to see around the country? I mean, is this an indication of where the country could go in 2018?
Well, in the wake of, if we were here 2 years ago, I would have said no one would elect Donald Trump president, especially who got his start in presidential politics being a birther. A birther, for to explain to our international audience, is somebody who does not believe that President Barack Obama was born in the United States, which he was, and was taken to be a very racist code message when you do that. So being a conservative, being a rock-rib Republican is different than being a bigot, okay? And that's where Roy Moore was different. So I think you may find Republican challenges, and that's the Trump wing of the party that doesn't like the establishment. You know, burn everything down, we'll rebuild it. So that could happen. But you have candidates that have better records, that want to govern, that don't have controversies in their past, that haven't been removed from their job twice as a state Supreme Court judge. Sometimes in American politics, the first step towards victory is having somebody run who doesn't have a blemished record. That might be true in every country that's listening to me right now. But when you start with somebody that has 2 strikes against them, it's just harder to win. And as it is just clear that Roy Moore was probably, and I hope Chip could come in, he was probably one of a handful of Republicans in Alabama who could not win. That's how Republican that state is.
Insult to Republican voters to run him because
let me get Chip in, and then I'll get to you, Jessica. Chip, go ahead.
I totally agree with that point. I think Roy Moore is among just a couple of Republicans that couldn't have defeated Doug Jones. You know, if you look at some of the polls that came out at the very start of the race, it was already competitive. I think these sexual assault allegations against Roy Moore, I don't think they were the deciding factor. I think it might have pushed it over the edge, but I think Doug Jones would have had a chance before. If we weren't focusing on the sexual assault allegations, I think the national media would have been here focusing on Steve Bannon. They would have been here focusing on his comments about the amendments after the first 10, the anti-slavery amendments and women's suffrage amendments. So if it wasn't the sexual assault allegations, it would have been something else, and I think it would have been competitive regardless.
So Jessica, here we have a candidate who, as we've just heard, could not have won in Alabama. As Len has been telling us, this is a deeply flawed candidate, twice removed from the Supreme Court, all these allegations of misconduct with teenage girls. Yet, he received the support of the president and the Republican Party. It came late, but he did get their support.
Begrudgingly and very late. Yeah. I think because really the leader of the party was supporting him, that the party wound up supporting him just in the hopes that they would have that vote. I mean, this is very much about the balance of power in the Senate and making sure that the Republican majority gives the president the kinds of outcomes that he wants, which is not a sure thing, even because there's a very, very narrow majority and not all the Republicans are voting with him. But I think overall, from an international perspective, what this tells us is that if Trump weighs in on your behalf, it's no guarantee. I mean, he does not have a good record on supporting and endorsing candidates and getting them over the finish line. Will we see him stop endorsing? Probably not. He likes to get out there and get some of the spotlight when it comes to retail politics too. But it is just, it's a loss for him. It's a loss for Steve Bannon, his former advisor. It's a loss for Roy Moore. I think in addition to being a win for the GOP, though, it's also a win for the Me Too movement because it really shows the momentum behind these allegations, and it's part of an overall trend in American society that's taking people down. And there are real consequences when you're accused of this type of behavior, and there's some evidence of it.
Let me get Dan's view on this. Dan, given that the Republican majority in the U.S. Senate is so small, why did they take a chance with a candidate like this and then support him?
I think you had a situation where the local party politics created a momentum behind Moore as opposed to Luther Strange, who's the sitting senator right now from Alabama. And when the party decided, and then when things started to come out about Moore in the public forum, some of the leadership in the Republican Party, namely Mitch McConnell, really went off the deep end, in my opinion, when he decided that he was going to decide who was going to represent Alabama because there would be an ethics inquiry the minute he walked in the door. I think that was a terrible mistake on the part of Mitch McConnell because he doesn't have the right to decide on who the people in Alabama get to choose for their senator or congressman in the state. And so the people, I think there are probably some people in the state who were angered at Mitch and the idea that the swamp was going to decide who was going to be seated at the table representing the state of Alabama.
Chip,
I want to jump in on that because I think Mitch McConnell's effect in all of this is a little bit overblown from the people I've talked to here. I think people are obviously irritated with Mitch McConnell as they are in other states across the country. But this really goes back to the appointment of Senator Luther Strange. A lot of people here in Alabama had a lot of problems with that because our former governor, who was also removed after a sex scandal, appointed Luther Strange, who was then the Attorney General, who was investigating the governor. So it looked like a quid pro quo to a lot of people, this for that. It looked like the governor was appointing Luther Strange to get him out of Alabama to end an investigation into wrongdoing. So that played a lot into the primary situation with Luther Strange, Mitch McConnell's candidate, getting beaten by Roy Moore pretty decisively in both situations. So I don't know how much Mitch McConnell played into all this. I really think it goes back to the complexities of Alabama politics. It's a crazy place here.
Right, and just for our viewers around the world, Mitch McConnell is the Republican leader of the Senate, where the Republicans, of course, have a majority. Then let me ask you this. The U.S. television network, NBC, reported that 58% of Alabama women voted for the winner, Doug Jones, including 35% of white women. That has to have had something to do with these allegations, right?
Possibly, and that is a exit poll that you're talking to, that all the networks chipped in on, and the cable outlets on that. So it's interesting that when you look at the exit polls, that in general, the higher educated white women, that tended towards the Democratic candidate. The less educated white women, lower income. Some of this sometimes just happens, breaks with the party divides, but it goes back to a point I do want to underscore, that one of the interesting things about this is that the sex allegations alone were not a deal killer. He remained a viable candidate till the end. So there were these other local factors at play. See, and this is why I think what Chip says has a lot of credibility here for those of us who have covered state politics, and that's what I came up doing. Before I came here, these local factors are big. The deal that that Chip described in getting Luther Strange his appointment, sometimes in the primary, you just take the person that you're mad at least or most because of these local issues, or you're mad at the governor, so you take it out on someone on it. And it's the history of Roy Moore that stuck with people, because the exit poll also showed that a lot of people made their minds up pretty early in the process.
Jessica, I want to get... Yeah, go ahead.
You're real quick. I agree.
Okay, Dan, you go ahead, and then I'll get to Chip. Go ahead, Dan.
I just wanted to say I agree with the comment that politics in America is local politics, and I think the young woman who just articulated what was going on in Alabama was that it's a local political situation. To take that, interpret that local politics into a change on the national scale, I think is a big reach.
Go ahead, Chip.
Yeah, I was just going to say that Roy Moore goes back a long time. He's been on the Supreme Court off and on for 2 decades. He's built a huge base in Alabama of socially conservative voters who oppose same-sex marriage, who oppose abortion, who want public prayer, and other socially conservative things. And he's relied on that base for a long time, and they came out in force in the primary to support him. But he also has a ceiling. And when he got into this general election, there were a lot of people who didn't buy into his pretty extreme socially conservative views.
And remember, he wasn't exactly going door to door right up until the elections were held. I mean, he was in other cities watching football games. He was not exactly coming out. And I think that confidence was misplaced in the end.